Long ago, in a world of oil lamps and whispering stone, there lived a boy who was taught to walk like a queen. He wore silk stitched for someone long dead. He learned to smile as if he remembered a life that wasn't his. Tonight, as we drift through forgotten corridors of Roman history, we will meet Sporus the boy who became a shadow sewn into the memory of a dead empress by the will of an emperor who could not let go. Let us begin gently, not with a clash of armies or the thunder of chariots, but with soft sandals brushing marble floors and a hush falling over the forum. It is early morning in Rome. The streets are quiet, veiled in that dim silver light that comes before the sun is brave enough to rise. A city built of columns and conquest stands still just for a moment. Behind closed shutters, the people sleep. The bakeries are not yet warm. The fountains murmur low, and pigeons gather at the feet of forgotten statues. And in this delicate silence, a procession appears. A man wrapped in imperial violet strides forward as if the city belongs to his breath. His name is Nero Caesar Augustus, Emperor. Beside him moves a figure dressed in flowing white, embroidered with golden leaves. A veil hides the face, but not the grace. The figure is elegant, deliberate, queenly. From a balcony above, a child watches and whispers, "That must be the Empress." But it is not. For beneath the pearls and painted lips is not a woman. It is a boy, no more than 15. A boy once born into servitude, now veiled in silk, renamed, reshaped, and remade. His name was Sporus, though by now few called him that. And what you are about to hear is not a story of Roman glory. It is not a tale of triumph or legacy. It is a quiet tragedy, a slow unraveling of identity, of power that whispered too sweetly, of grief that refused to die. You may close your eyes now, if you wish. There is no need to watch, just listen and drift. Let us go back, before the veil, before the silk, before he became someone else, back to when the empire was still bathed in the promise of gold. Back to when another boy named Nero sat upon the throne. Back to when it all began. Before he was a man draped in shadows. Before his name became a whisper of cruelty. Nero was a boy. A quiet boy, some said. Others said he laughed too loudly at the wrong times. But all agreed he was never truly alone. You see, Nero was not born into peace. He was born into a Rome that had forgotten how to rest. At the heart of this city of domes and politics, of fountains and whispers was a palace. And within that palace, a boy sat beneath the watchful gaze of a mother who did not blink. Her name was Agrippina. She was not gentle, she was not cruel, she was purposeful. Agrippina the younger had survived more than most. She had outlasted emperors, avoided poisons, and carved her place in marble, not by lineage alone, but by determination sharper than any dagger. To her, the world was a game of placement, of who stood behind whom, of whose voice echoed longest in the halls of power. And her son Nero was her chosen piece. He was placed carefully in rooms with tutors who taught him Greek verse, in gardens with men who whispered the rhythms of command, in theaters where applause sounded like loyalty. Agrippina shaped him like wet clay. She sculpted a future where her voice would guide his every decree. For a time, it worked. In the year 54, the Emperor Claudius died, though how precisely he died is a question historians like to murmur about after dusk. And with his passing, the boy stepped into a crown that gleamed too brightly for his tender years. Nero was 16. 16 years old, an emperor of the largest empire the Western world had ever seen. At first, Rome held its breath. Would the boy crumble under the weight of the purple robe? Would he falter before the Senate's piercing eyes? But he did not. In those early years, those golden, softened years, Nero surprised them all. He reduced heavy taxes that had burdened the countryside. He banned executions without trial. He opened theaters and held games for the common folk. He sang poems he had written himself, shyly at first, and then louder when the applause grew warmer. They called him generous, artistic, a new kind of emperor, less soldier, more philosopher. And the people, who had known too much blood and too many lies, allowed themselves to hope again. It felt, for a short while, like springtime. But even in spring, some flowers open too fast, some vines curl too tightly, and some light, no matter how golden, hides the shadows it casts. Behind the curtains of public joy, Agrippina still whispered. She walked through the palace like a ghost who had never died. She sat at meetings. She read his letters before he did. Her coins bore her face beside his. Her voice still rang before his name in decrees. The boy began to chafe. He was no longer 16. He was growing, and with that growth came questions. Where did his will begin and hers end? In the hush of late evenings, he would wander the palace corridors alone, his footsteps soft on stone. Sometimes, they say, he would stop at a mirror and stare, not at his reflection, but at what stood behind it. He had the power of gods, yet could not move without her breath on his neck. Something inside Nero shifted like wine left too long under heat. In time, Agrippina's voice grew quieter, not because she had finished speaking, but because she was gone. They say she died at sea, that Nero ordered a special boat built to collapse upon her, that when it failed and she swam ashore, soldiers were sent to finish what the waves would not. We do not know her final words, only that Nero said she deserved to die, and that Rome, for a moment, looked away. After her death, he still sang, yes, still wrote poetry, still built statues and summoned philosophers. But there was a new sharpness in his gaze, a tightness in the way his hands gripped the arms of his throne. The applause no longer reached him the same way. He began to wonder which smiles were honest and which eyes watched him too long. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rome stopped whispering in joy. It began to whisper in fear. But let us not rush. Let us linger in this in-between, this narrow window between promise and collapse. Picture him now. Nero, still young, still full of song, walking through the gardens of his palace. The air smells of olive branches and lavender. A musician plucks a gentle string nearby. Servants drift like shadows, and somewhere, just beyond the archway, a new name is waiting. A woman with red hair and clever eyes, Papaya Sabina. But let us leave her there, for now, just out of reach, just beyond the light. There are names in Roman memory that do not shout, but linger like a fading scent caught in silk. Papaya Sabina was one of those names, not because of battle nor decree, but because of how softly and completely she changed the air around her. Before she was empress, before her face was etched in marble, she was a presence subtle, golden, and poised like a candle that refuses to flicker. Her beauty was well known, yes, but it was her manner that drew eyes and held them. Her gaze was quiet but steady, her voice thoughtful, her steps unhurried. In a world built on volume and violence, Papaya was composed stillness, and perhaps that is why Nero noticed her. Or perhaps he was always looking for someone to quiet the storms he could not name. When Nero first saw her, he was still married to Octavia, the daughter of a former emperor marriage of ice, designed to preserve alliances but not affection. Octavia was gentle, reserved, and silent in public, the kind of wife a statue might envy. But Papaya was warmth and movement, cleverness veiled in courtesy. Where Octavia endured, Papoja observed. Where Octavia faded into the background, Papoja made the room gentler by simply entering it. Nero, who had never been truly seen except through the eyes of his mother, began to feel visible in Papia's gaze. She laughed at the right time, listened closely, and offered neither fear nor flattery. It was not adoration she gave him, but something that felt like understanding. Soon, she was near him more often, not with announcement, but with naturalness, as if the spaces around Nero had always been shaped for her to step into. She joined him at feasts, in shaded gardens, on long walks through colonnades lined with statues of forgotten ancestors. And in time, she stayed. The whispers in Rome turned to murmurs, then to shock, when Nero cast Octavia aside and declared Papaya his new empress. The wedding was a spectacle of gold and roses, of silver lamps and perfumed fountains, the kind of evening that made Rome forget its own hunger. Papaya wore white, threaded with pearls, and Nero stood beside her, not as a ruler, but as a man who believed for a moment that he had found something he could keep. But love, for Nero, was never still. It needed to surround, to control, to consume. And Papaya, delicate as she appeared, was never fragile. She used her growing influence, wisely elevating her allies, protecting her interests, guiding decisions from just behind the throne. She did not shout, but she was heard. She did not command, but she was obeyed. And for a while, it worked. Nero adored her. He commissioned endless portraits of her painted, sculpted, carved into precious stone. He surrounded himself with her likeness, even in places where no one else was allowed. He built gardens for her, poured wealth into jewels she might wear only once, and assigned guards not to protect her, but to keep her near. But what he loved most was that she made him feel chosen. Yet even Papaya, with all her grace, could not always bend. She did not flatter him blindly. She sometimes corrected him. She sometimes disagreed. And perhaps that was her great mistake, because for Nero, love was not a partnership, it was possession. The line between worship and ownership blurred quickly. The more she reminded him of her independence, the more he tried to erase it, not with words, but with silence, with tightened control, with long, watchful stares. And so, the adoration that once felt like light began to darken. What once was golden became amber, then ash. But we will not step into that moment just yet. It waits in another room, under a darker lamp, as the last warmth of the day settles into stone. He speaks to her of poetry and stars. She smiles, gently, and listens. And somewhere in that silence, history begins to hold its breath. The palace had grown quieter in those days. The laughter was still there, sometimes echoing faintly from garden courtyards, or drifting from candlelit chambers after the last course of dinner. But it no longer reached the corners. The servants stepped more carefully. Musicians played with gentler hands. And Papaya, she moved a little slower now. Her body had begun to change again. She was with child, Second one, they hoped. The first had not stayed. This one, she said softly, would be different. Nero believed her. He believed everything she told him, because to do otherwise would have meant admitting the cracks he refused to see. There is no single account of what happened. History, like marble, wears down with time. One version tells us that it was a quarrel, sharp but ordinary. That Nero came home late perhaps from the races, perhaps from rehearsal for a performance, and Papa Ya made a remark. Something small, perhaps about his priorities, or about the child, or perhaps nothing at all. Another version says it was an argument about music, or money, or Rome itself. But all versions agree on one thing: the emperor lost control. Whether it was a word, or a gesture, or a blow, no one now can say with certainty. But something in that moment turned. Something snapped, not in Rome, but in him. Papa Ya, delicate in her condition, collapsed. Some say he struck her in the abdomen. Others say he kicked her. Some even suggest he hadn't meant to harm her at all. But the result was the same. She began to bleed. The servants were summoned, then the physicians. Nero paced the corridors, his hands shaking, his voice low and frantic. He shouted, then begged, then prayed, but it was too late. The child was lost, and soon after, so was she. They say he wept over her body, that he clung to her, spoke to her, commanded her to wake, that he promised her temples, statues, immortality, if only she would open her eyes, that he offered the doctors anything they asked, money, land, mercy, if they could undo what he had done. But there are some things that even emperors cannot command. Papa Ya Sabina, Empress of Rome, died quietly in a chamber lined with ivory and gold. Outside, the city continued to breathe, unaware that something within the heart of the empire had just faded into shadow. Nero did not burn her body, as was custom. He could not bear the thought of flame. Instead, he had her embalmed, like the queens of Egypt, and placed in a tomb more elaborate than many emperors had received. He declared her divine, as if naming her a goddess might cleanse what had happened. He built a cult in her honor, and in private he whispered to her still. The palace changed. Papia's presence, once living, became symbolic. Her seat remained empty at banquets. Her name was spoken in the present tense. Her favorite perfumes still filled the halls, renewed daily by servants who dared not question. And Nero, he lingered in the rooms where she had once laughed, his steps echoing without purpose. He talked to her likeness. He stared at portraits for hours. He dreamed aloud. There are moments in history when time does not move forward, but simply folds inward. This was such a moment. Nero had crossed from mourning into something else, not grief, but obsession reborn in silence. And somewhere in the depths of that silence, another name began to surface. A boy, a shadow, a face that, to the emperor's haunted eyes, looked just enough like hers. But let us not speak his name yet, not just yet. Let us linger here, a little longer, in the stillness that follows the end of something beautiful. The lamps in the palace have been dimmed. The corridors are hushed, and far beneath Rome, the tomb of Papa Ya rests in stone, surrounded by silence, filled with flowers that never fade. After Papa Ya was gone, Rome seemed to carry on as before, its streets still crowded, its fountains still singing, its markets still echoing with trade and gossip. But within the palace, time had folded in on itself. Nero no longer moved with the ease of performance. He wandered, instead, through marble halls like a man lost in a memory he could not leave. The emptiness was everywhere, not in the grand chambers or polished stone, but in the spaces Papaya had once filled with her presence. Quiet as it was, it had been real. And now, all that remained were shadows wearing her scent. They say he could not bear to be alone, that he spoke to her image carved in alabaster, that he pressed his face into the folds of her gown, still preserved in her wardrobe, that he listened for her voice in the hush of long corridors. And yet, for all his mourning, there was no healing, only longing, a hunger for what could not return. But then one day, in the ordinary rhythm of court life, someone caught his eye. The boy's name was Sporus. He was perhaps 14 or 15, born into the household as a slave, later granted his freedom as a gesture of imperial generosity. He had been educated, trained to serve in clerical duties, a position of relative privilege for someone of his station, and yet he was invisible in the way that servants often are, always present, never truly seen, until now. What made Nero notice him is difficult to explain. The ancient writers suggest it was his face, delicate, refined, with eyes shaped like papias, with the same quiet symmetry, the same softness at the corners of the mouth. And in a world like Rome, where appearance was more than vanity wear, the face was believed to reveal the soul. That resemblance was not easily dismissed. To Nero, grieving and drifting, the boy did not look like Sporus. He looked like her, and that was all it took. The emperor began to observe him, not speak, just watch. At first from a distance, then more closely, a passing glance during a banquet, a quiet moment during scroll readings, and slowly, the boy was called closer. He was assigned to new duties, private ones, tasks in Nero's chambers, accompanying the emperor on quiet walks through hidden gardens. No one dared question it. To be chosen by Nero was both blessing and danger. Sporus, it seems, did not understand what his selection meant, not yet. One evening, as the lamps flickered low and the city darkened beyond the palace walls, Nero called for him, and from that moment on, Sporus's name would no longer belong to himself. There is a hush that settles in history before something unspeakable. It does not scream, it simply stills. A breath before the storm, a pause before the shatter. Sporus stood in that hush, perhaps unaware, perhaps uncertain. He had no power to refuse, no protection, no family, no name that could save him. He was, in every sense, at the mercy of an emperor, grieving not a wife, but a possession. And in his grief, Nero did not wish to be comforted. He wished to reverse time. What came next was not a request. It was not a conversation. It was not love. It was transformation decided by another, and it had already begun. But we will speak of that soon. For now, let us leave Sporus standing there, still himself, for a little longer, in the quiet light of an antechamber, wearing the clothes of a servant, unaware that they would soon be replaced with gowns, unaware that his name would be replaced, unaware that before long he would no longer be allowed to walk as himself. Let us hold this moment before the change, because once it is gone, it will never return. There are moments in history that feel as though they do not truly belong to time. They unfold behind closed doors, whispered into silence, recorded not in marble or decree, but in the tremble of those who were changed by them. What was done to Sporus was never announced to the people of Rome. It was not debated by senators or etched into tablets. It was quieter than all of that, and far more permanent. When Nero decided that the boy would become Papaya, There was no declaration. There was only arrangement. The palace staff received new instructions. Seamstresses were summoned. Physicians were called. Servants were reassigned. And Sporus, once a boy with quiet duties and few expectations, was quietly moved to a new chamber, larger, warmer, hung with drapes the color of pale dawn. Inside, perfumes lingered in the corners. Gowns were laid out across the bed, white, soft, shaped to flatter curves that Sporus did not yet possess. He was told to undress, then to bathe, then to wait. The physicians came at dusk. We do not know their names. History did not keep them. We do not know what words were spoken, if any. Perhaps they were gentle. Perhaps they were indifferent. They had performed surgeries before most, often on those considered disposable. Castration in ancient Rome was not common, but it was not unknown. It was brutal. It was crude. It was irreversible. And yet it was done. There are no poems about this moment, no statue, no coin, only fragments from ancient historians, dry, brief, distant. But one need not read deeply to understand the pain. The physical pain, yes, sharp and unrelenting. But more than that, the loss of something unseen, the loss of self. Sporus emerged from that room no longer the same, his body altered, his identity slipping. The days that followed were quiet. He was not permitted to leave his new quarters. Attendants came and went, cleaning, preparing, measuring. A new name was whispered now as they worked. Sabina, her name. The lessons began next. He was taught how to move, how to sit, how to smile gently without showing too much tooth. He was shown how to keep his voice soft, how to laugh without sound. He was dressed in layers of fabric designed to hide what no longer existed and suggest what never had. Gowns tailored to someone else's memory. Jewelry that once adorned another's body. Makeup applied each morning to create the illusion of her face. And the mirror waited for him. Each morning, Sporus was made to stand before it, his reflection, dressed not in the present, but in the past. Each day, a little more of himself was lost, not erased violently, but faded, like ink left in the sun. The transformation was not only physical, it was ceremonial, imperial. Nero wanted not only a woman, he wanted her. Papa Ya returned, and so every detail was crafted to match. Sporus was told the Empress's favorite colors, her mannerisms, her posture. He was taught how she once held her cup, how she tilted her head when listening, how she turned toward the light. Memory became curriculum, grief became design. And through it all, Nero watched, not with cruelty, perhaps, but with need, a hollow kind of need. He was not building a person, he was building a monument, a moving, breathing monument to something he had destroyed and could not live without. To Sporus, this was not transformation. It was disappearance. He was not becoming someone else. He was vanishing, and the world around him applauded in silence, too afraid to look too closely, too afraid to ask what it meant for a boy to be turned into an echo, a shadow stitched into silk. The preparations, they say, lasted weeks, perhaps longer. The palace whispered, but never too loudly. Everyone knew, but no one intervened. Not in Rome, not when the emperor mourned. When it was nearly complete, Nero gave the order. There would be a wedding. The palace was not quiet anymore. It hummed with preparation. Silks were carried from storerooms rarely opened. Gold was polished until it caught even the faintest lamplight. Couriers came and went at all hours, their sandals brushing the marble floors like rustling leaves. The smell of imported flowers clung to the halls, stronger than perfume. sweeter than memory. Rome was preparing for a wedding, but no one quite knew how to speak of it. Outside the palace, the people of the city only saw glimpses. A new veil being carried in the wind, a chariot being repainted in ivory and crimson. They whispered. Of course, Rome was always whispering. They said the emperor was to marry again, that grief had softened, that love had returned. But those who served within the palace knew better. They had seen the boy, seen his eyes, heard the voice that now tried to rise an octave higher, each syllable carefully rehearsed, and they understood that this would not be a wedding. It would be something else entirely. Nero spared no expense. He ordered musicians trained in the old melodies of the imperial line. Priests were summoned, robes bleached, scrolls written anew. The hall was dressed in candlelight. Thousands of small flames swayed in golden bowls, casting long shadows onto the columns. The air was thick with frankincense, heavy with anticipation. And at the center of it all stood Sporus, now called Sabina-clothed, in a gown woven for someone who no longer breathed. The jewels that hung from his neck had once kissed Poppia's skin. The crown nestled into his hair had been reshaped to fit a head not made for it, and his hands, gloved in lace, trembled just beneath the surface. When Nero entered, the room hushed, not out of reverence, but uncertainty. This ceremony was unlike anything they had ever seen or ever would again. The emperor walked toward the boy in silence, a faint smile on his lips, not of joy, but of arrival, as if he had finally completed something long unfinished. The priests began the ritual. The prayers were spoken, vows recited, bread broken, wine poured, rings exchanged. Every moment followed the ancient forms, every word carefully chosen, but nothing could cover what lay beneath. To the guests, it was a play beautifully acted, disturbingly real. They clapped where expected, toasted as instructed, handed over their gifts with polite smiles and uneasy eyes. No one dared refuse. No one dared name the thing they were witnessing, because in the empire of Nero, language had limits, and truth, too often, was whatever he needed it to be. After the ceremony, a feast was held, the finest dishes, the softest music, laughter that echoed a little too sharply off the stone. Sporus sat beside Nero, as any empress would. He nodded at the right times. He lifted his cup. He smiled when Nero looked his way, and when the emperor called him by Poppia's name, he answered because he had been taught to. But what passed between them was not affection. It was preservation. Sporus had learned how to anticipate moods, how to avoid offense, how to disappear into performance. And in this, he became masterful. His voice grew steadier, his gestures more fluid, his presence less his own. The guests, in time, began to forget what had once been. They saw the gown, the jewels, the title, and in the quiet parts of their minds, they accepted the illusion, because it was easier than resisting it. From that day forward, Sporus was treated as empress. He was given his own attendants, his own quarters, his own retinue. He dined beside the emperor, rode in his chariot, walked at his side through public ceremonies. Wherever Nero went, Sporus followed not as himself, but as a memory reborn. And Rome, ever practical, adjusted. They called him Lady Sabina. They bowed when he passed. They stopped asking questions. But behind the painted face, behind the lowered lashes, behind the soft replies, the boy remained, tucked somewhere deep, silenced, preserved only in memory. He still remembered himself at all. As the months passed, the illusion no longer needed to be explained. Sporus had become Sabina in all the ways that mattered to the imperial court. The titles were spoken easily, the gowns fit more naturally, the voice, once halting and unsure, now moved like water across polished stones. And Nero, content within the dream he had carefully built, decided it was time to show the world what he had made. He would go to Greece. This journey was not one of politics or conquest. It was not a tour of duty, nor a gesture of statecraft. It was, instead, a performance, a long, slow procession of self-admiration. Nero fancied himself an artist, a musician, a poet of divine touch, and Greece, the land of Homer and theater and Olympian gods, would be his audience. The imperial court packed in silence. Servants carried cases of instruments, scrolls, and silk robes. Ships were prepared, draped in violet banners, trimmed with gold. The sea waited quietly, its surface flat and endless. And aboard one of the great vessels stood Sporus now, entirely encased in Poppia's image. He wore travel gowns designed to shimmer in the Mediterranean light. His hair was styled in braids that had once adorned the empress's brow. He was no longer addressed by his birth name, even in private. Nero did not allow it. The journey itself was long, but gentle. The sea breezes were mild. The nights were cool. The stars blinked softly above the waves. But within the emperor's ship, the atmosphere was peculiar, neither joyous nor mournful, but suspended, as if time had stopped for the sake of Nero's fantasy. Each morning, Sporus was dressed. Each afternoon, he stood at the emperor's side as performances were given, songs, recitations, dramatic reenactments of myths, with Nero always at the center. The crowds in Greece, too wise or too frightened to resist, applauded with rehearsed enthusiasm. And always Sporus was there, a quiet figure in the background, veiled, serene, eyes lowered. His role was not to speak, but to exist gracefully, gently, as a symbol, a moving monument to a woman lost. Foreign dignitaries bowed before him. Local priests offered gifts. Greek nobles, trained in the art of pretense, addressed him in tones reserved for goddesses. They all knew, of course, but truth, in such a world, had become irrelevant. The people of Greece saw a boy clothed in the past, but Nero saw only his wife in temples. He whispered to Sporus as if they shared memories. He recalled events that had never happened, jokes that had never been told, anniversaries that belonged to another life. And Sporus, with perfect discipline, responded as if he remembered too. There must have been moments late at night, when the ships lay still in quiet harbors, when Sporus sat alone, far from the emperor's gaze, and tried to recall his own name, the one he had been born with, the one spoken to him by his mother, long ago, before the palace, before the mirror, before the knife. But even that memory, by now, would have grown faint, like a shoreline disappearing in the fog. In Athens, Nero insisted on competing in every artistic festival. He played the lyre. He acted in tragedies. He wept on cue. The judges, terrified or obedient, awarded him every prize. Wreaths of olive leaves were placed upon his head, applause echoing too loudly in nearly empty theaters. And through it all, Sporus remained nearby, watching, nodding, performing the performance. To outsiders, it may have looked like the emperor was celebrating beauty, art, and culture, but in truth, he was celebrating only himself. and in doing so, he brought with him the one object of beauty. He could not bear to lose the shape of Papuasia, reborn in borrowed skin. But empires, like illusions, do not hold forever. Even as Nero sang in the marble theaters of Delphi and Corinth, the foundations of his rule were crumbling. Back in Rome, the Senate murmured, the legions grew restless. The governors in distant provinces began to speak too boldly. They had tolerated Nero's art. They had endured his indulgences. But his absence, his disregard, was too great a weight. The message came not with ceremony, but with certainty. Rebellion had begun. And just like that, the dream began to unspool. The message arrived like a cold wind through an open arch with archway, silent, undeniable. Nero, far from his capital, stood on a stage in Corinth, basking in the sound of forced applause, when a whisper reached his ear. Rebellion. The Senate had turned. The Praetorian Guard had withdrawn its loyalty. The provinces, once obedient, had begun to raise other names, new emperors, new hopes. Rome no longer wanted its performer. The stage had collapsed. There was no time for ceremony, no farewell speech, no grand exit. Nero fled. The journey back was not triumphant. It was a quiet scattering of one's loyal companions, each slipping away under cover of darkness. But Sporus remained. When Nero left Greece in secret, Sporus was there. When he abandoned his finery and changed into plainer clothes, Sporus followed in silence. He did not ask questions. He did not beg to stay behind. Perhaps he no longer remembered how to be apart. They returned, not to a palace, but to a villismal, distant, hidden among olive trees and shadows. The birds there sang softly in the morning, as if unaware that the most powerful man in the known world was now a fugitive. Nero paced its rooms like a restless echo. He could not sleep. He could not eat. He asked again and again what the Senate might do to him if captured. No one answered. He dressed the emperor in the mornings, as he always had. He prepared the basin for washing. He brought food that was left untouched. Sometimes Nero spoke to him not of power, but of fear. He described the humiliations that might await, the torments, the spectacle of public death. He could not bear it. He would rather die in private, on his own terms, but even that he could not do alone. In the final hours, Nero asked for assistance. No one stepped forward. At last, with trembling hands, he took the blade himself, and Sporus, his shadow, his living doll, the last witness to the illusion, was there to see it end. The emperor, who had once commanded legions, who had rewritten gods in his own image, died not with grandeur, but with a whimper, surrounded not by senators or soldiers, but by silence. And Sporus. What passed through the boy's mind in that moment, we do not know. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Perhaps the absence of Nero felt like freedom, or perhaps it left him even more alone. Either way, he remained for a time, until the door opened again. Rome returned. With Nero dead, the empire began to move quickly. New names were spoken, new robes worn, new statues raised. And Sporus, once the emperor's fantasy, became a problem. He had been too visible, too symbolic. He carried within his veiled form the most intimate scandal of Nero's reign, and so he could not be allowed to vanish quietly. He became property. He was passed from one powerful man to another, like a jewel that had once belonged to a disgraced dynasty. First to Nymphidius Sabinus, a commander who thought possessing Sporus might help claim legitimacy, then to Otho, one of the new emperors, then to Vitellius. Each treated him as Nero had, not as a person, but as a relic. They dressed him in women's clothing, called him by the name that wasn't his, displayed him, sometimes publicly, sometimes in private. He was no longer Scipio, he was no longer Sabina, he was something in between, a symbol, a burden, a beautiful, painful reminder of a Rome that wanted to forget. And then came the final insult. Vitellius, in his hunger for entertainment, decided that Sporus would be used in a public spectacle, a theatrical execution, a reenactment of an ancient myth, perhaps that of Proserpina, the goddess who was taken against her will. Sporus would be the centerpiece, not as an actor, but as a victim, before thousands. We do not know how he received the news, whether he cried, whether he simply nodded, whether he laughed tired and brittle as if it had always been leading here. What we do know is that he chose not to appear. Before the day came, he took his own life. Some say it was poison, others say a dagger. The method is not remembered, only the silence that followed, the hush of a city that barely noticed, the ending of a name that had already been erased. He was perhaps 20 years old, not an empress, not a wife, not a man permitted to be a man, not a child who had been allowed to remain a child, just a boy once. A boy who learned how to smile with another person's lips, how to answer to another person's name, how to disappear beautifully, and in the end, how to say no quietly, finally, completely. In the vast and tangled fabric of Roman history, there are names carved in triumph, others in blood, and some that were never carved at all. Sporus is among the last. His name, if it was truly his, does not live on in statues or epics. There are no buildings named for him, no festivals, no shrines. What remains are only fragments, passing mentions in the works of ancient men who wrote from a distance, who saw in him not a person, but a symptom of someone else's madness. Tacitus, Suetonius, Diothe wrote of Nero, and in doing so, touched briefly on the shadow walking beside him. A boy, they said, who resembled Popoja, a boy castrated and married, a boy dressed in silk and taught to smile with another's teeth, a boy who died by his own hand. But beyond these cold notations, we know almost nothing of who he was before. No letters, no sketches, no words spoken in his own voice. We do not know what Sporus wanted, what he dreamed of, what made him laugh when he was still allowed to, what he thought about in the quiet spaces between commands, what he might have become had Rome not decided to make him something else. And that, perhaps, is the deepest sadness of all. Because Sporus did live. He walked across mosaic floors. He stood beneath cedar beams and perfumed torches. He felt the weight of gold around his neck and the heat of lamps on powdered skin. He learned how to perform a person he never chose to be, and he did so with a grace that frightened even those who made him do it. But none of that was his. His body was not his. His name was not his. Even his death, though chosen, was shaped by the cage that surrounded him. To exist in history only as a reflection is to never truly be seen. Sporus became a mirror for Nero's grief, a canvas for an empire's discomfort, a whisper at the edge of another person's tragedy. He was remembered not for who he was, but for who he was made to resemble. And yet, there is something unerasable in even the faintest life, a presence, a pressure, like the shadow of a figure that once stood in a sunlit doorway. We cannot see him clearly, but we feel that he was there, that he mattered, that beneath the layers of lace and perfume, beneath the silence and obedience, there remained a flicker of someone real, someone who remembered what it felt like to be a child in a crowded city, someone who once spoke his own name aloud and believed it would be enough. Perhaps that flicker never died. Perhaps it was what led him, finally, to choose a different ending, to reclaim the one act that had not been choreographed for him. In saying no, in stepping away from the stage he had never asked to stand on, Sporus may have done the bravest thing of all. He reminded the world, quietly, that he had once been alive, and though the world tried to forget him, he remains. In footnotes, in fading ink, in stories told at the edge of night. Tonight, as we drift further into stillness, let us remember him not as an empress, not as a figure of scandal, not as a strange curiosity of Roman history. Let us remember him as a boy with soft eyes, a boy who survived longer than anyone expected, a boy who bore the weight of someone else's memory until it nearly erased him, and yet, in the end, chose to be free. Close your eyes now. Let the torches of Rome fade behind you. Let the marble halls grow quiet. Let the silks fall from your thoughts. The boy has walked on, and all that remains is peace. Good night, Sporus, wherever your name truly rests.